When I was away on a business trip in London, my parents sold my house to fund my younger sister's luxury vacation. When I walked through the door, my father smirked and told me my empty house just paid for their fun. I did not even scream. I did not even cry. I just smiled back and opened my briefcase. He shouted, asking why I was so calm. I looked him dead in the eye and replied because the house you just sold was legally transferred to a blind trust 3 years ago. My name is Maya, and I am 32 years old. I had spent my entire life playing the role of the quiet, responsible daughter, always sacrificing my own peace to maintain the delicate balance of our household. But seeing them toast to my financial ruin was the final straw. Before I show you how my family ultimate betrayal turned into their absolute ruin, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated you. The wheels of my suitcase glided silently across the imported Italian marble of my parents' lavish Buckhead estate. I had just landed in Atlanta after a grueling 3-week business trip in London, securing a massive contract for my architectural visualization agency. I was utterly exhausted, running on nothing but airplane coffee and the anticipation of sleeping in my own bed. But as I approached the sunken living room, the sound of popping corks and loud, joyful laughter stopped me in my tracks. I rounded the corner to find my family celebrating. My 24-year-old sister Sienna was twirling around the room holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. Her white husband, Preston, stood by the custom wet bar laughing loudly, while my parents beamed at them with absolute adoration. Designer luggage was strewn across the velvet sofas, half-packed with resort wear and brand-new snorkeling gear. Nobody noticed me at first. I stood in the archway watching the flawless picture of suburban black excellence my parents worked so hard to project to the rest of the world. Then my father, Andre, finally spotted me. Instead of welcoming me home from my international trip, he lowered his glass. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He picked up a thick stack of stapled papers from the glass coffee table and tossed them down with a heavy thud. "Welcome home, Maya," he said, his voice booming with misplaced authority. "We have some family business to discuss." I walked slowly into the room, the exhaustion suddenly vanishing from my bones. "What is this?" I asked, looking down at the documents. My father puffed out his chest. "Your mother and I decided to take care of that empty, useless midtown townhouse of yours. We sold it yesterday morning, $900,000 in cash." The room went completely silent, except for the soft jazz playing through the ceiling speakers. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline of a terrible joke, but Preston chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "We closed the deal quickly, Maya. Sienna and I need the capital." My father nodded proudly. "Exactly. Your sister and Preston are flying out tomorrow for a month-long vow renewal in the Maldives. The rest of the cash is acting as seed money for Preston New Wealth Management Fund. Your house paid for their future. Do not look so shocked." Before I could even process the absolute absurdity of their confession, my mother Renee stepped forward. She smoothed down her silk blouse and gave me that familiar, condescending glare I had endured my entire life. "Do not start being selfish, Maya," she warned, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You are 32 years old, without a husband, and without children. You spend all your time drawing fake buildings on a computer. Sienna is building a high-profile life. She is a lifestyle influencer married to a brilliant financial mind. They have an image to maintain in this community. It is your duty as the older sister to support them. You should be proud to contribute to your family's success instead of hoarding a property you barely even use." Her words were meant to cut me down, to remind me of my designated place in the family hierarchy. Growing up, Sienna got the pageants, the luxury cars, and the constant praise. I got the leftovers and the lectures on why I needed to work harder to compensate for not being the pretty one. They worshipped the ground Sienna walked on and treated Preston like royalty simply because his finance bro persona fit their desperate need for elite country club validation. I looked at the four of them standing there in their designer clothes, drinking champagne bought with stolen money. They expected me to break down. They expected me to scream or cry or beg for my property back. They were waiting for the emotional reaction that would allow them to call me crazy and dramatic. I did not give them the satisfaction. I slowly took off my trench coat and draped it over a chair. I offered my mother a bright, genuine smile that made her take a sudden step back. I unzipped my leather briefcase and reached inside. My father's smirk faltered. "Why are you so calm?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the large room. "You just lost your house and you are standing there smiling like a lunatic." I pulled out a thick red folder and dropped it directly on top of his fraudulent paperwork. "I am calm because you are ignorant," I replied, keeping my tone dangerously even. "You did not sell my house, Dad. The property you just fraudulently signed away was legally transferred to a corporate blind trust 3 years ago. You have absolutely no legal right to it anymore." Preston let out a loud, patronizing chuckle. He set his crystal champagne flute on the marble coaster and stepped in front of my father. Preston was wearing a navy-tailored suit that probably cost more than my parents' mortgage payment for the month. He had that classic finance bro arrogance radiating from every pore. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and amusement, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a confused toddler. "Maya, you really do not understand how real estate law works, do you?" he said, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "You see, when property sits unused and taxes are handled through a primary familial trust, the original guarantors retain certain rights of reallocation." My father nodded along proudly, hanging on to every word his white son-in-law said as if it were gospel. Preston adjusted his expensive watch and leaned against the custom wet bar. I utilized my private connections in the city planning office to bypass all that typical bureaucratic red tape. We did not use a traditional real estate agent, Maya. I brokered the sale myself using a standard quitclaim deed directly to a corporate buyer. An aggressive private equity firm called Vanguard Holdings. They pay strictly in cash, no inspections, no waiting periods. The wire transfer cleared yesterday afternoon. It was a high-level financial maneuver. I would not expect you to grasp the intricacies of corporate acquisitions. He picked up his champagne again, taking a slow sip before delivering what he thought was the final blow. "You draw pictures on computers for a living, Maya. You make nice little brochures and fake three-dimensional models. Leave the high-level finance and the real-world adult business to the men in the room. You should honestly be thanking me for liquidating a dead asset and turning it into working capital for the family." My sister Sienna sneered from her spot on the velvet sofa. "See, Maya, Preston actually knows how to multiply wealth. You just sit in a dark room playing on Adobe Illustrator all day, while my husband is building an empire. You are just mad because a real man took charge of the situation." I stood there, letting their insults wash over me. For years, this exact dynamic had played out at every Thanksgiving, every birthday, every forced family dinner. Preston would use big corporate buzzwords to mask his average intelligence, and my family would applaud his genius while simultaneously mocking my career. They thought my architectural visualization agency was just me playing with digital crayons. They had no idea I managed multi-million-dollar contracts with international developers, handling complex corporate structures and international compliance laws every single day. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached into my red folder and pulled out a stapled packet of official documents. I placed them flat on the glass coffee table right next to my father's fraudulent deed. "That is fascinating, Preston," I said, keeping my voice dangerously soft. "It is truly remarkable that you managed to broker a cash sale to Vanguard Holdings without realizing who you were actually dealing with." I tapped the top page of the packet. "These are the official state registry documents and the articles of organization for Vanguard Holdings. You might want to read the name of the sole managing member." Preston rolled his eyes, letting out a heavy sigh as if I were wasting his valuable time. He picked up the documents with one hand. His eyes scanned the first page, then they stopped. He blinked and read the paragraph again. The arrogant smirk melted off his face instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. His hand began to tremble slightly, making the heavy paper shake. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice suddenly hoarse. I smiled warmly. "That is the legal proof that Vanguard Holdings is a private shell company entirely owned and operated by me. I set it up 3 years ago to manage my private real estate portfolio. So when you thought you were bypassing the red tape and quietly selling my house to an anonymous corporate entity, you were actually selling my house back to me." My father looked confused, stepping closer to look at the papers. "What is she talking about, Preston?" I kept my eyes locked on my brother-in-law, watching the sheer panic set in. "Let me break down this high-level financial maneuver for you, Preston. You convinced my parents to forge my signature on a quitclaim deed. You then took $900,000 of stolen investor money from your own failing wealth management fund and wired it directly into my corporate business account to purchase a house that I already legally owned. You literally just laundered stolen money into my bank account and handed me the receipts." Sienna stood up, her face pale. "Preston, what is she saying? Is that true?" Preston could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor, splashing expensive liquor across my mother's designer rug. He realized in real time that he had just committed federal wire fraud and handed the victim all the evidence wrapped in a neat little bow. "You did not liquidate a dead asset, Preston," I continued, my voice cutting through the silent room like a knife. "You walked straight into a federal crime and you dragged my foolish parents right down with you." Preston took a step back, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. He looked at the door, then back at the papers. His mind was racing, trying to find a loophole, a way to mansplain himself out of a federal prison sentence. But there was no escape. The documents were ironclad. Sienna grabbed his arm. "Tell her she's lying, Preston. Tell her she does not know what she's talking about." But before Preston could even attempt to form a lie, my mother Renee threw herself between us. She physically shielded her white son-in-law, pushing me back with a fierce, panicked look in her eyes. The protective instinct she never once showed me was now completely focused on defending a man who had just implicated our entire family in a massive financial fraud. "Stop it, Maya!" my mother screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "You always do this. You always try to destroy your sister's happiness. You think you are so smart with your hidden companies and your trapdoors. But you do not own that house. You never really owned it. You have no right to punish Preston for taking back what belongs to us." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. "Belongs to you?" I asked. "Yes," my mother yelled, spit flying from her lips. "We paid the original down payment on that house when you were 22. We put the roof over your head. It is our asset. It has always been our asset. You owe this family, Maya. You owe us everything." My mother took another step forward, her eyes blazing with an irrational fury. "We sacrificed everything to raise you," she continued, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We gave you the foundation to build your little computer business. That house in Midtown was just a stepping stone we provided. So what if Preston used his connections to reallocate it? He is family. He is building a real legacy for Sienna while you sit alone hoarding wealth like a bitter old spinster. You should be down on your knees thanking us for involving you in this family empire." Preston stood behind her, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He was letting my mother do his fighting for him, hiding behind a 56-year-old woman, because his fragile ego had been completely shattered. "You owe us your life, Maya." My mother finished, breathing heavily, pointing at the red folder. "So you are going to rip up those papers. You are going to sign the real estate transfer back to Preston right now, and you are going to let your sister enjoy her vacation." I looked at her desperate, angry face. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel the sting of a mother's rejection anymore. I only felt the cold, hard certainty of the truth I was about to unleash. I reached back into my briefcase. My fingers brushed against the smooth, cool leather before wrapping around a second stack of documents. These were much thicker and older than the red folder. The edges of the paper were slightly frayed and yellowed with age. My mother was still panting, her chest heaving as she glared at me with absolute hatred. She took a step forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. She screamed that I had no right to act like a victim. She yelled that she and my father had paid the original $40,000 down payment on that midtown townhouse when I was 22 years old. She claimed they had given me the foundation for my entire adult life, and therefore the property was morally and rightfully theirs. She told Preston to ignore me because I was just a bitter, ungrateful child trying to play legal games. My mother was relentless. She paced back and forth across the destroyed Persian rug, stepping over the shattered glass of Preston-ruined champagne flute. She ranted about how much blood, sweat, and tears she had poured into raising me only for me to turn around and weaponize a corporate technicality against my own flesh and blood. Sienna nodded along violently, agreeing with every toxic word our mother said. Sienna chimed in, claiming I was completely unhinged and that no normal sister would secretly hide her assets behind a blind trust just to trap her family. They were trying so hard to flip the script. They were desperately trying to make me the villain of this story so they would not have to face the reality of what they had done. I let out a low, dark laugh that cut through their frantic shouting. The sound of my laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings, making the room go dead silent. I did not waste my breath arguing about moral ownership. I did not try to narrate the miserable years I spent working 80-hour weeks to pay the mortgage on that house while they completely ignored me. Instead, I let the evidence do the talking. I pulled the heavy stack of aged papers from my briefcase and slammed them down on the glass coffee table right next to the Vanguard Holdings registry. The loud smack made both my mother and Sienna flinch. "Look closely at those papers, Mom," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "Those are certified bank notices. Default warnings. Final notices of foreclosure from exactly 5 years ago." My father instantly went rigid. All the color drained from his face, and he took a sudden stumbling step backward away from the coffee table. He knew exactly what those papers were. My mother stopped pacing. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Preston leaned forward, squinting at the bold red letters printed across the top page. I stared directly into my father's terrified eyes. 5 years ago, I received a call from the federal authorities, I explained slowly, making sure every single person in the room heard every word. They informed me that I was under investigation for severe bank fraud. I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. But then they showed me the paperwork. Somebody had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on my midtown townhouse, a massive loan processed entirely in my name. The signatures on the loan documents were perfectly forged. The digital authorizations were traced to an internet protocol address originating from this exact suburban estate. You and Mom took out a second mortgage on my house using my stolen identity, and then you deliberately defaulted on the payments. Sienna gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. She looked at our parents in absolute horror. Preston stood completely paralyzed. The confident, arrogant finance bro, who had just lectured me about corporate acquisitions, was now staring at my parents like they were radioactive. He had married into this family believing they were generational wealth. He had believed my father was a titan of industry, and my mother was a high society matriarch. Now he was discovering that his perfect wealthy in-laws were nothing more than desperate identity thieves who funded their fake luxury lifestyle through blatant fraud. The realization that he had tied his own failing wealth management fund to a family of criminals was visibly breaking his mind. Sienna was shaking uncontrollably. Her entire carefully curated lifestyle influencer persona was built on the lie of this house. She filmed her makeup tutorials in the marble bathrooms and bragged about her wealthy family to her followers. Now she was standing in the middle of a home bought with stolen money, realizing that her upcoming luxury vacation to the Maldives was funded by yet another layer of pathetic financial crime. She looked at our father with tears streaming down her face, unable to comprehend that the man who spoiled her rotten was actually a desperate fraud. You nearly sent me to federal prison, Dad. I continued, my voice rising just enough to shake the crystal glasses on the wet bar. You maxed out a fraudulent loan in my name and left me to take the fall. And do you want to know the best part, Preston? I turned my attention to my arrogant brother-in-law. Do you want to know what my loving parents did with that stolen money? They used it to pay the enormous cash down payment on this very mansion. This beautiful, lavish Buckhead estate, where you are all standing right now sipping champagne and celebrating my demise, was bought with money they stole from my name. My mother realized that the narrative was completely slipping out of her control. She could not gaslight her way out of certified bank documents. She could not manipulate Preston into saving them because Preston was currently hyperventilating near the wet bar, realizing his own federal exposure. Renee tried to step forward again, but her legs seemed to give out. She sank onto the edge of the velvet sofa, her manicured hands trembling violently. She tried to say that family forgives family, that blood is thicker than money. But the words died in her throat when she looked at the cold, unyielding expression on my face. "Maya, please," she whispered, her voice cracking with sudden panic. "We were going to pay it back. The business was struggling, and we just needed a bridge loan to maintain our lifestyle. We could not let the country club know we were having cash flow problems. We were protecting the family image. Protecting the family image." I repeated, feeling a cold smile stretch across my face. You nearly ruined my life for an image. The bank was ready to seize my townhouse and file criminal charges against me. But I did not let them. I worked myself to the bone. I took on international clients and slept 4 hours a night to build my agency. But I did not just quietly pay off the defaulted loan, Mom. I am not that stupid anymore. I hired the best corporate attorneys in Atlanta, and I executed a very specific financial maneuver. I pointed down at the stack of foreclosure notices. I had Vanguard Holdings buy the distressed debt directly from the bank. I bought the second mortgage that you fraudulently opened. I own the debt tied to your names. The bank transferred all rights, all liens, and all collection powers directly to my corporate entity. I own every single penny of the financial crime you committed to buy this suburban mansion. The sheer magnitude of my statement hung in the air like a physical weight. My parents were completely trapped. They had spent years treating me like a disposable asset, thinking I was too weak and too quiet to ever fight back. They thought I was just a naive girl playing on a computer. They had absolutely no idea they were dealing with a woman who had spent the last 5 years quietly building an impenetrable fortress around her life. I looked my parents dead in the eyes, watching their arrogant facades shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "I am not your daughter today," I stated, my voice echoing with cold, absolute authority. "I am your primary creditor, and you are officially in default." For a split second, nobody moved. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. Then pure animalistic panic took over. My father let out a guttural roar of absolute desperation. He lunged across the glass coffee table, his hands reaching frantically for the stack of foreclosure documents, as if destroying the paper would somehow erase the reality of his crimes. My father grabbed the thick stack of foreclosure notices with both hands. His knuckles turned stark white as he gripped the heavy paper. He let out another furious roar and ripped the documents cleanly down the middle. He did not stop there. He tore the halves into quarters and the quarters into eighths, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar as he shredded the evidence of his financial crimes. He threw the pieces into the air with a violent, sweeping motion. The shredded paper fluttered down like a perverse snowstorm, settling over the imported rugs and the spilled champagne. He breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he glared at me. He genuinely believed that destroying the physical paper would somehow erase the digital records and the legal reality of what he had done. He stepped around the glass coffee table, closing the distance between us with heavy, stomping boots. He was a large man, and for my entire childhood, he had used his physical size to control the room and crush any dissenting opinions. He puffed out his chest and stood mere inches from my face, attempting to use sheer patriarchal dominance to force me into silent submission. "I am the head of this house. he roared, his voice vibrating through the hardwood floorboards. I built this family from absolutely nothing. I gave you the clothes on your back and the expensive food in your mouth. You do not come into my home after 3 weeks away and disrespect me with your fake corporate papers and your computer nonsense. I possess this property. I own the ground you are currently standing on. You are nothing but an ungrateful, bitter child who cannot stand to see her beautiful younger sister succeed where you have failed. You will turn around right now and you will get out of my sight before I physically make you leave. 10 years ago, his booming voice and physical intimidation would have made me shrink away in pure absolute terror. I would have immediately apologized and run to my room crying, begging for his forgiveness. But looking at him right now, I felt absolutely nothing. I did not flinch or blink. I did not step back to give him space. I just looked at his red, sweating face and saw him for exactly what he was. He was just a desperate, pathetic man who had gambled away his entire family's security for a country club membership and a false sense of superiority. My mother was openly sobbing on the velvet sofa, begging him to calm down, while Sienna watched with wide, terrified eyes. Preston was still standing completely frozen by the custom wet bar, unable to move or speak, as the reality of his own wire fraud sank deeper and deeper into his fractured mind. They were all completely powerless in the face of their own actions. I did not argue with my father. I did not yell back or try to explain the cold immutability of digital banking ledgers and state records. I simply reached into the tailored pocket of my slacks and pulled out my cell phone. "Who are you calling?" My father demanded, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings in the large living room. "Put that phone away, Maya. I am talking to you, and you will listen. You do not ignore the head of this family when he is speaking to you." He reached out his large hand to grab my wrist, but I smoothly sidestepped his clumsy attempt. I unlocked my bright digital screen and opened my secure encrypted messaging app. I tapped on the very first contact in my urgent favorites list. I did not need to type a long, complicated explanation or a desperate cry for help. I only needed a single word to set the final trap into motion. I typed the word "now" and pressed send. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and clasped my hands neatly in front of me, maintaining perfect, unwavering eye contact with the man who had just aggressively demanded my immediate departure. My father let out a harsh, breathless laugh. He looked back at Preston and my mother, shaking his head in arrogant disbelief. "She has completely lost her mind," he muttered, running a shaking hand over his sweating forehead. "She thinks she can text some fake computer lawyer and scare us out of our own home. I want her out of here, Renee. I want her gone right this second." Before my mother could even attempt to formulate a response, a heavy, mechanical click echoed through the dead silent house. It was the distinct sound of the massive double oak front doors being unlocked from the outside with a physical key. The heavy brass hinges creaked loudly as the doors swung wide open, letting a sudden gust of humid Atlanta air sweep right through the grand marble foyer. My father froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. Sienna gasped sharply and clutched a decorative velvet throw pillow tightly to her chest. Footsteps echoed loudly on the polished marble floors of the entryway. They were slow, deliberate, and completely unhurried steps of a man who owned every room he walked into. A tall, imposing figure stepped through the wide archway and into the sunken living room. It was Isaiah. He was my lead corporate attorney and undeniably the most ruthless legal mind in the entire state of Georgia. Isaiah was impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal gray suit with a crisp white shirt and a perfectly knotted dark silk tie. His expensive leather Oxfords gleamed under the warm light of the crystal chandelier. He carried himself with an ice-cold, absolute authority that instantly dwarfed my father's desperate patriarchal bluster and made Preston look like a scared intern. "Who the hell are you?" my father yelled, taking a threatening step toward the archway. "How did you get a key to my house? I am calling the local police right now and having you arrested for criminal trespassing." Isaiah did not even blink or slow his pace. He completely ignored my father's loud shouting, as if the older man were nothing more than a minor background annoyance. He walked across the room with smooth, confident strides, completely bypassing my weeping mother and trembling Sienna on the sofa. He walked straight up to the glass coffee table, where the shredded pieces of the foreclosure notices still lay scattered around like worthless garbage. Isaiah carried a sleek black leather portfolio tucked neatly under his arm. He did not bring unverified copies this time. He did not bring printouts of bank statements or digital ledgers for them to argue over. He unsnapped the portfolio and pulled out a single thick document bound in heavy premium legal paper. It bore the bright blue raised seal of the Fulton County Superior Court and the fresh, authentic, wet signature of a federal judge. Isaiah dropped the heavy document directly onto the glass table, right on top of my father's destroyed papers. The heavy thud resonated through the quiet room, snapping everyone to attention. My father suddenly stopped shouting. He stared down at the blue seal, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror. He knew enough about the law to recognize a final court order when he saw one. Isaiah slowly and methodically adjusted his silk tie, making sure the knot was absolutely perfect. He looked around the room, analyzing the sheer visceral panic on the faces of Preston and Sienna, before finally locking his cold, dead eyes directly onto my father. "You do not own this suburban house either, Andre," he stated, his voice completely flat and devoid of any human empathy or emotion. "When you intentionally defaulted on that fraudulent second mortgage, you opened using Maya's stolen identity. You triggered a massive cross-collateralization clause with your primary lenders. The bank immediately bundled the toxic debt. Maya, private corporate limited liability company, bought the foreclosure deed to this exact estate last month for literal pennies on the dollar." Isaiah tapped the sealed legal document on the glass table with one perfectly manicured finger, leaning forward just slightly. "That document is an active judge-signed eviction notice and an immediate legal property seizure order. You have exactly 2 hours to vacate her premises before I have the armed marshals physically remove you from the property." The absolute silence that followed Isaiah's words was deafening. The reality of his statement hung in the air, pressing down on my parents like a physical weight. 2 hours. They had exactly 2 hours before armed federal marshals would physically drag them out of the sprawling suburban mansion they had fraudulently purchased. My mother collapsed back onto the velvet sofa, unable to process the total destruction of her fake high society life. But it was not my mother who broke the silence. It was Sienna. My younger sister had been standing near the wet bar, clutching a decorative throw pillow. When she finally understood that we were not just talking about my midtown townhouse, but the actual mansion she was standing in and the Maldives vacation she was leaving for tomorrow, her brain completely short-circuited. Sienna let out a piercing, high-pitched wail that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She dropped the velvet pillow and literally collapsed onto the imported marble floor. She fell to her knees, her expensive designer dress pooling around her, as she began sobbing hysterically. She slammed her manicured hands against the marble, screaming that her entire life was ruined. She wailed that her luxury Maldives wedding vow renewal was the centerpiece of her social media content calendar for the entire quarter. She cried that she had already teased the trip to her followers and that her entire aesthetic was about to be destroyed because of me. Instead of looking at her husband who had just committed federal wire fraud or our parents who had stolen my identity, Sienna turned all of her venom directly onto me. She scrambled up from the floor, her face red and streaked with waterproof mascara. She pointed a trembling finger at my face and unleashed years of built-up entitlement. She screamed that I was nothing but a bitter, jealous recluse. She yelled that I hated seeing my younger sister win because I had no real life of my own. She claimed that she was the beautiful, successful face of our family brand. She said she carried the social weight of our family name while I just hid in dark rooms drawing fake buildings on a computer screen. She sobbed that her high-end luxury sponsors would drop her the second they found out the Maldives trip was canceled. She yelled that I was actively trying to make Preston and his elite wealth management firm look weak in front of their wealthy investors. I stood there watching my 24-year-old sister throw a literal temper tantrum over her fake internet life while her husband faced federal prison. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her appearance or her lifestyle. I simply turned to Isaiah and held out my hand. My attorney reached into his sleek leather portfolio and handed me my digital tablet. I unlocked the screen and opened a comprehensive dossier my team had compiled over the past 3 months. I looked at Sienna and told her to stop screaming. I told her we needed to have a very real conversation about her highly successful career as a luxury lifestyle influencer. Sienna stopped crying for a fraction of a second, wiping her eyes as she glared at me. I looked down at my screen and began reading aloud from her influencer portfolio. I listed the names of the exclusive boutique travel brands and the high-end resort wear companies that supposedly sponsored her lavish trips and sent her thousands of dollars in promotional packages. I read off the specific engagement metrics and the payment structures she loved to brag about at family dinners. I calmly explained to the room that my architectural visualization agency works directly with global luxury hospitality brands every single day. I told Sienna that I know exactly how luxury marketing budgets are allocated, and I know exactly who manages the vendor accounts for high-end resorts in places like the Maldives and Dubai. I took a slow step toward my sister, keeping my eyes locked on her tear-stained face. I told her that none of the boutique travel brands sponsoring her content actually exist. They are not real companies. They have no physical products, no actual hotel properties, and no genuine customer base. Sienna shook her head aggressively, telling me I was crazy, and that she received direct wire transfers from these brands every single month to promote their aesthetic on her page. She looked at Preston for support, expecting her brilliant finance husband to step in and defend her business model. But Preston was staring at the floor, looking like he was about to physically be sick. I tapped the screen of my tablet, pulling up the back-end technical data my firm had meticulously traced. I explained to my sister that I had my network security team run a deep diagnostic trace on every single one of her so-called luxury sponsors. I pulled the corporate registry filings, the domain name registrations, and the digital routing numbers for the wire transfers she was so incredibly proud of. I read the data aloud, letting the cold, hard facts dismantle her entire reality. Every single digital footprint, every corporate email address, and every single web server hosting those fake luxury brands traced back to one specific location. I turned my tablet around so Sienna could clearly see the highlighted data map on the screen. The Internet Protocol addresses for her entire influencer empire, all routed directly to a private server located in Preston Wealth Management Office downtown. Sienna stared at the screen, her eyes moving back and forth as her brain struggled to comprehend the technical information. I did not let her remain in confusion. I broke it down into the simplest possible terms. I told her that she was not an influencer. She was a mule. Preston had been creating fake shell companies and using her social media accounts as a glamorous front to generate fake marketing expenses. He was using his own clueless wife to launder stolen money from his failing wealth management firm. Her entire beautiful, successful life was nothing but a digital money laundering scheme orchestrated by the man standing right next to her. The absolute reality of Isaiah's words struck the room like a physical blow. 2 hours. My father stared at the blue quartz seal, his chest heaving as the last remaining shreds of his fake authority evaporated into thin air. My mother let out a strangled gasp and buried her face in her hands, unable to comprehend that she was about to be thrown onto the street by federal marshals. But it was not my parents who broke the suffocating silence. It was Sienna. My younger sister had been standing near the custom wet bar, clutching a decorative throw pillow to her chest. When she finally processed that the eviction notice meant the immediate end of her luxurious lifestyle, her brain completely short-circuited. Sienna let out a piercing, high-pitched wail that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She dropped the velvet pillow and literally collapsed onto the imported marble floor. She fell to her knees, her expensive designer dress pooling around her as she began sobbing hysterically. She slammed her manicured hands against the marble, screaming that her entire life was ruined. She wailed that her luxury Maldives wedding vow renewal trip was the absolute centerpiece of her social media content calendar for the entire quarter. She cried that she had already teased the exotic vacation to her followers, and that her entire carefully curated aesthetic was about to be completely destroyed because of my vindictive jealousy. Instead of looking at her husband who was currently facing federal wire fraud, or our parents who had stolen my identity, Sienna turned all of her venom directly onto me. She scrambled up from the floor, her face red and streaked with expensive waterproof mascara. She pointed a trembling finger at my face and unleashed years of built-up spoiled entitlement. She screamed that I was nothing but a bitter, jealous recluse. She yelled that I hated seeing my younger sister win because I had no real life of my own outside of my dark office. She claimed that she was the beautiful, successful face of our family brand. She said she carried the social weight of our prestigious name while I just hid behind computer screens drawing fake buildings. She sobbed that her high-end luxury sponsors would drop her the second they found out the Maldives trip was canceled. She yelled that I was actively trying to make Preston and his elite wealth management firm look weak in front of their wealthy investors just to satisfy my own pathetic insecurities. I stood there watching my 24-year-old sister throw a literal temper tantrum over her fake internet life while her entire world burned down around her. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her appearance or mock her shallow priorities. I simply turned to Isaiah and held out my hand. My attorney reached into his sleek leather portfolio and handed me my digital tablet. I unlocked the screen and opened a comprehensive investigative dossier my network security team had compiled over the past 3 months. I looked at Sienna and told her to stop screaming. I told her we needed to have a very real conversation about her highly successful career as a luxury lifestyle influencer. Sienna stopped crying for a fraction of a second, wiping her eyes as she glared at me with pure hatred. I looked down at my bright screen and began reading aloud from her official influencer portfolio. I listed the exact names of the exclusive boutique travel brands and the high-end resort wear companies that supposedly sponsored her lavish trips and sent her thousands of dollars in promotional packages. I read off the specific engagement metrics, the brand partnership tiers, and the monthly payment structures she loved to brag about at our forced family dinners. I calmly explained to the room that my architectural visualization agency works directly with global luxury hospitality brands every single day. I told Sienna that I know exactly how luxury marketing budgets are allocated, and I know exactly who manages the vendor accounts for high-end resorts in places like the Maldives, Dubai, and Monaco. I took a slow step toward my sister, keeping my eyes locked on her tear-stained face. I told her that none of the boutique travel brands sponsoring her content actually exist. They are not real companies. They have no physical products, no actual hotel properties, and no genuine customer base. Sienna shook her head aggressively, telling me I was crazy, and that she received direct wire transfers from these brands into her business account every single month to promote their aesthetic on her page. She looked at Preston for support, expecting her brilliant finance husband to step in and defend her lucrative business model. But Preston was staring at the floor, his breathing ragged, looking like he was about to physically be sick. I tapped the screen of my tablet, pulling up the back-end technical data my firm had meticulously traced. I explained to my sister that I had my top network security team run a deep diagnostic trace on every single one of her so-called luxury sponsors. I pulled the corporate registry filings, the domain name registrations, and the digital routing numbers for the massive wire transfers she was so incredibly proud of. I read the data aloud, letting the cold, hard facts dismantle her entire reality piece by piece. Every single digital footprint, every corporate email address, and every single web server hosting those fake luxury brands traced back to one highly specific location. I turned my tablet around so Sienna could clearly see the highlighted data map glowing on the screen. The Internet Protocol addresses for her entire influencer empire, all routed directly to a private server located inside Preston's wealth management office downtown. Sienna stared at the screen, her eyes moving rapidly back and forth, as her brain struggled to comprehend the undeniable technical information displayed in front of her. I did not let her remain in confusion. I broke it down into the simplest possible terms. I told her that she was not an influencer. She was a mule. Preston had been creating fake shell companies and using her social media accounts as a glamorous front to generate fake marketing expenses. He was using his own clueless wife to launder stolen investor money from his failing wealth management firm. Her entire beautiful, successful life was nothing but a digital money laundering scheme orchestrated by the man standing right next to her. Sienna let out a choked gasp as the weight of my words finally crushed her delusions. She looked from my tablet to Preston, her eyes begging him to call me a liar. But Preston could not even meet her gaze. He stumbled back against the wet bar, his hands shaking violently as he realized I possessed the exact digital footprint of his entire criminal operation. My mother let out another horrified sob from the couch, realizing her golden child was married to a man who was using her as a human shield for federal crimes. My father stood completely frozen, the shredded foreclosure papers forgotten on the glass table, as he watched his perfect family legacy disintegrate into dust. I stared at my sister, watching the beautiful, successful face of the family process the fact that she was nothing more than an unwitting accomplice to massive corporate fraud. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I just tapped the screen of my tablet one final time, locking the evidence away. I watched the blood drain entirely from Preston's face. His skin turned a chalky, translucent white that made him look physically ill. The arrogant finance bro persona that he had wielded like a weapon against me for the past 7 years shattered into pieces right there on the imported marble floor. He was no longer the smug executive sipping expensive champagne and lecturing me about corporate acquisitions. He was a cornered animal, realizing that all the exits were completely blocked. Sweat began to bead across his forehead and upper lip. It trickled down his neck, soaking into the starched collar of his custom-tailored navy suit. He started pacing in erratic, tight circles, shaking his head back and forth as if trying to physically deny the reality of the digital evidence I had just presented. He looked at the tablet, and then looked at Sienna, and then looked back at my attorney Isaiah. His chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. He suddenly turned his entire focus onto Sienna, holding his hands out in a desperate, placating gesture. He started yelling, his voice completely losing its practiced, smooth cadence. It cracked and pitched upward, sounding thin and pathetic. He told Sienna that she could not possibly believe a single word I was saying. He launched into an aggressive tirade, attempting to gaslight his own wife right in front of us. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and screamed that I was just a bitter, manipulative computer nerd who harbored a lifelong vendetta against their happiness. Preston yelled that I had used my advanced digital design skills to completely fabricate those internet protocol addresses and corporate registry filings. He claimed that I was an expert at faking digital environments and that I had simply manufactured this entire dossier just to destroy their perfect marriage. He frantically insisted that his wealth management firm was thriving and that her luxury brand sponsors were absolutely legitimate. He told Sienna that the wire transfers were real and that I was just a jealous recluse trying to tear down the beautiful, successful face of the family. Sienna remained kneeling on the floor, her designer dress pooled around her trembling legs. She looked up at her husband with absolute devastation etched into every line of her face. She was desperately trying to process his frantic lies, but the technical data I had shown her was too thorough and too undeniable. She asked him in a broken whisper why the server was located in his specific office building. She asked him why her high-end luxury brands had no actual physical products or registered trademarks. Preston could not give her a straight, logical answer. He just kept yelling louder and louder, trying to drown out the undeniable truth with sheer volume. He realized that his smooth corporate vocabulary was no longer working on her. His panic rapidly mutated into physical aggression. He lunged forward, closing the distance between them, and grabbed Sienna roughly by her upper arm. He yanked her upward, forcing her to her feet with a sudden, violent jerk. Sienna let out a sharp cry of pain, stumbling awkwardly against him as he gripped her forearm tight enough to leave immediate red marks on her pale skin. He told her that they were leaving the house right this second. He screamed that I was framing them with fake documents and that they needed to get far away from me before Isaiah tried to involve the federal authorities. He started physically dragging her toward the grand double doors of the foyer, pulling her like a rag doll while she stumbled in her expensive heels. I did not step forward to physically intervene. I did not need to block the doorway or raise my voice to stop him from fleeing the scene. I simply reached into the tailored pocket of my slacks and pulled out my personal cell phone. I unlocked the screen and navigated to my saved audio files. I held the phone up high, making sure the speaker was aimed directly at the fleeing couple. I told Preston that if he truly wanted to talk about who was fabricating evidence and framing who we should listen to, a very specific message he left for me exactly 2 weeks ago. I pressed play. The audio file filled the cavernous living room, easily cutting through the sounds of my mother sobbing on the velvet sofa and Preston frantic, heavy breathing. The recording was crystal clear. It was unmistakably Preston's voice, but it sounded absolutely nothing like the arrogant titan of industry who had mocked my career earlier this evening. The voice echoing from my phone was pathetic, weak, and completely broken. It was the undeniable sound of a desperate, terrified man sobbing uncontrollably into his phone in the middle of the night. In the recorded voicemail, Preston was crying hysterically. He was literally begging my architectural visualization agency for a private corporate bailout loan. He pleaded with me to authorize a secret transfer of $500,000, explaining through heavy sobs that he had been margin called on a massive and incredibly reckless cryptocurrency bet. He openly admitted on the recording that his supposedly elite wealth management firm was completely insolvent. He confessed that he had secretly leveraged his own clients' investment portfolios to cover his massive gambling debts, and that the federal regulators were closing in on him. He sobbed so hard on the recording that he could barely catch his breath, begging me to wire the money through an anonymous shell company so his investors and my family would not find out about his crimes. Preston froze halfway to the front door. He instantly let go of Sienna's arm, stepping back as his own recorded confession echoed off the high walls of the foyer. He stared at my phone as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. The recording kept playing, delivering the final, devastating blow. On the audio file, Preston took a ragged, wet breath and lowered his voice to a pathetic, conspiratorial whisper. He begged me to keep the bailout loan a complete secret from the entire family. He explicitly stated that his own wife was completely clueless about their imminent financial ruin. He told me that Sienna was stupid and useless, and that she only cared about buying expensive designer shoes and making fake internet videos. He begged me to save him from federal prison, because he knew I was the only person in the entire family who actually had real money. The recording clicked off, leaving a deafening, heavy silence in its wake. Sienna stood completely frozen in the middle of the grand marble entryway. The red marks from Preston's aggressive grip were still visibly blooming on her arm, but she did not seem to feel them at all. She slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Her tear-streaked eyes were wide and filled with an absolute soul-crushing horror. The man she had built her entire public brand around, the man she had worshipped and defended against me for years, had just called her stupid and useless while begging her sister for $500,000. Preston opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at his horrified wife, and then looked over at my attorney Isaiah, who was standing calmly by the glass coffee table, watching the total destruction unfold with a cold, detached professionalism. Preston had spent his entire adult life manipulating people with corporate buzzwords and fake confidence. Now he was stripped completely bare, his massive fraud and his pathetic cowardice exposed for everyone in the room to see. Sienna let out a sound that was barely human. It was a breathless, choked sob that seemed to physically tear its way out of her chest as she stared at the man she married. The heavy silence in the grand living room was thick enough to choke on. The absolute reality of the situation had finally crushed the last remaining breath of defiance out of them. My father was leaning heavily against the wall, his chest heaving as he stared blankly at the shredded eviction notice on the floor. Preston was completely paralyzed in the corner, looking like a cornered animal who knew the federal authorities were already closing in. Sienna was still weeping on the marble tiles, her fake luxury influencer life completely dismantled. But it was my mother who suddenly seemed to understand the true gravity of the legal danger they were all facing. She looked at Isaiah standing there with his cold corporate authority, and then she looked at the digital evidence on my tablet. The reality of wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering finally penetrated her delusions. She realized that no amount of screaming or country club entitlement was going to save them from a federal indictment. The haughty, aggressive matriarch vanished in an instant. My mother slowly lowered herself to the floor. Her knees hit the imported rug with a soft thud. She crawled forward, her designer dress dragging across the shattered glass. She reached out with shaking hands and desperately grabbed the fabric of my trousers. Tears began to stream down her perfectly powdered face, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, deliberately pulling the ultimate emotional manipulation card that had kept me trapped in her web for my entire early life. She started crying loudly, begging me to listen to her. She told me that I could not do this to them. She sobbed that we were a black family in a world that already wanted to see us fail. She gripped my legs tighter, telling me that society was just waiting for an excuse to tear down successful black men like my father and Preston. She pleaded with me, saying that I knew exactly how the justice system worked and that I could not bring the federal government into this house to destroy our legacy. She wept that we had to protect our own. She told me that no matter what happened with the house or the money, we shared the same blood, and that meant we had to stick together against the outside world. She begged me to call off Isaiah and to drop the charges against her husband and her son-in-law. She cried that I was her daughter, and that family loyalty was the only thing that truly mattered in this life. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I watched her weaponize our race, our heritage, and our shared struggles just to save herself from the consequences of her own blatant greed. For years, that exact guilt trip had worked on me. For years, she had used the concept of family loyalty to drain my bank accounts, to force me into submission, and to make me quietly endure their relentless emotional abuse. But standing there now looking at her pathetic, groveling display, I felt absolutely nothing. My expression turned to absolute stone. I did not yell. I did not pull my legs away from her grasp. I simply looked down at her with a quiet, devastating calm that made her desperate sobbing slowly trail off into a fearful whimper. I told her to let go of me. My voice was so soft and so dangerously quiet that the entire room seemed to freeze. She slowly pulled her hands back, shrinking away from the coldness in my eyes. I turned back to my leather briefcase resting on the edge of the sofa. I reached into the deepest pocket and pulled out something that did not belong in this modern, pristine mansion. It was a rusted old bank ledger. The dark green cover was peeling, and the pages were yellowed with age. The smell of old paper and dust filled the air between us as I opened the heavy binding. I looked at my mother, who was still kneeling on the floor. I told her that if she wanted to talk about protecting our own, we needed to look at the historical record of her loyalty. I flipped open the ledger to a specific bookmarked page. I told the room that this was the original financial ledger from my late grandmother. My grandmother, who had worked her entire life scrubbing floors and saving every possible penny to make sure I would have a future. I read the numbers out loud, my voice steady and unforgiving. I read the exact total of the college fund my grandmother had left solely in my name when she passed away. It was a trust meant to ensure I would never have to struggle the way she did. Then I read the withdrawal dates. I read the exact dates and the massive sums of money that were systematically drained from that account the very month I turned 18. I looked my mother dead in the eye and recited the bank transfer logs. I matched the first massive withdrawal directly to the invoice for Sienna Extravagant Sweet 16 party. The ice sculptures, the celebrity disc jockey, the custom designer gown, and the catered venue. It was all paid for with my stolen education fund. Then I read the second transfer. I read the exact dollar amount that perfectly matched the down payment on my father's brand new Porsche, the car he had proudly paraded around the neighborhood to prove his fake success. I snapped the rusted ledger shut. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I told my mother that she had stolen my future to pay for a teenage party and a sports car. I told her that while I was working 3 minimum-wage jobs just to afford community college textbooks, she was drinking expensive champagne funded by my dead grandmother's sacrifice. I looked down at her tear-stained face, stripping away the last illusion of her maternal grace. "You did not protect your own mom," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "You ate your own to feed your ego." The sound of Sienna crying should have broken any father's heart. Any normal parent would have immediately dropped to their knees to shield their youngest child from a man who had just admitted to using her as a criminal pawn. But Andre was not a normal father. He was a man utterly obsessed with social status and the fragile illusion of generational wealth. He had spent his entire life cultivating an image of power and control, and he was willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood to maintain it. Instead of comforting his devastated daughter, my father stepped right over her, kneeling form, and marched directly toward me. His face was flushed dark red with self-righteous anger. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at my chest and began yelling with absolute blind conviction. He screamed that Preston was a real man who was simply taking high-level financial risks in a cutthroat market. He yelled that I was nothing but a small-minded contractor who sat in a dark room all day and completely failed to understand complex corporate maneuvers. He stood there in the grand foyer of a house built on lies and viciously defended the man who had just insulted his own daughter. My father claimed that elite wealth management required aggressive strategies and brutal sacrifices that ordinary people could never possibly comprehend. He actually puffed out his chest and stated that Preston needed the money from my townhouse to save his investment fund from a temporary liquidity crisis. He proudly announced to the entire room that he had personally given Preston the ultimate authorization to sell my property because it was the only logical way to protect the family legacy. I stood there staring at the man who had raised me, completely stunned by the sheer magnitude of his toxic delusion. He was literally standing over his sobbing, broken daughter to defend the spineless criminal who had just destroyed her entire life. He was justifying the theft of my property as if it were a brilliant business transaction that I was simply too ignorant to appreciate. I did not yell back at him. I did not let my emotions rise to meet his chaotic energy. I kept my voice perfectly even and cold. I looked him dead in the eye and asked him a very simple, logical question. I asked Andre exactly how Preston managed to bypass the strict federal identity verification protocols required for a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction. I reminded him that I was the sole legal owner of the downtown property and that executing a sale required extensive background checks, notarized signatures, and valid government-issued identification. My father did not even flinch at my question. He was so completely blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate, pathetic need to be part of the elite financial world that he saw absolutely no issue with what he had done. He stood tall in the center of the marble floor and proudly admitted his crime as if he had executed a brilliant strategy. He told the room that he had personally accessed his old locked tax records to retrieve my private information. He bragged that he had dug through a heavy fireproof safe in his private study to find my old expired state identification card and handed it directly to his son-in-law. He actually smiled a smug, superior smile as he explained how easily they had pushed the fraudulent real estate deal through the system using his connections. He looked at me with absolute contempt and stated that he did it because he was the patriarch, and it was his fundamental duty to save the family empire from ruin. He believed that sacrificing my financial security was a noble choice for the greater good of his fake wealthy image. He spoke as if I should be thanking him for allowing my stolen assets to save his precious reputation. He fully expected me to be crushed by this revelation. He expected me to bow my head and accept that my identity and my property were simply acceptable collateral damage in his grand master plan. Instead, I just looked at him with a cold, detached pity. I did not need to say a single word to dismantle his pathetic illusion. I simply took a half step back and turned my eyes toward my attorney. Isaiah stepped forward, his expensive leather shoes making a sharp, echoing sound against the marble floor. He was a man who handled hostile corporate takeovers and vicious legal battles for breakfast. He did not yell or lose his temper. He just smiled coldly at my father. It was a terrifying clinical smile that carried the absolute certainty of an apex predator who had just trapped its prey in a corner. Isaiah reached into his sleek leather portfolio and slowly pulled out a thick stack of official government paperwork. The documents were printed on heavy stationery bearing the unmistakable official seals of federal regulatory agencies. Isaiah looked directly at my father and spoke with a calm, devastating precision that cut through the tension in the room. He explained that my network security team had detected the unauthorized access to my credit profile nearly 3 months ago. He stated that we knew the exact moment my social security number had been compromised and used to initiate the fraudulent property transfer. Isaiah held up the thick stack of papers showing my father the official case numbers and investigator signatures stamped on the front pages. He told Andre that we had not just sat back and helplessly watched them steal my home. We had immediately flagged the identity theft and the unauthorized wire transfers to the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission the very second they happened. We had been tracking every single fraudulent document and every single illegal signature they processed. My father's arrogant posture began to crumble visibly as the reality of Isaiah's words sank into his brain. The proud patriarch who thought he was playing high-level corporate chess suddenly realized he had walked blindly into a massive federal trap. His face lost its angry red color and turned a sickly shade of gray. The hand that had been pointing at me just moments ago dropped limply to his side. Isaiah took one final step forward, his voice dropping to a chilling authoritative register that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. He looked my father dead in the eye and delivered the final blow. Isaiah told Andre that he had not saved any investment fund and he had not protected any family empire. He told my father that by willingly handing over my social security number and actively participating in the real estate fraud he had just given the Federal Bureau of Investigation, written undeniable proof of his direct complicity in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy. The silence that followed my words was heavy and absolute, but it was shattered a second later by the loud, persistent ringing of the doorbell before anyone could even move. The grand double doors of the foyer swung wide open. The living room was instantly flooded with 20 people. My aunts, uncles, and cousins, all dressed in their Sunday best, walking right into the middle of a literal war zone. They were arriving early for what was supposed to be Sienna Bon Voyage, champagne brunch instead of a celebration. They walked in to find my mother kneeling on the floor surrounded by shattered glass, Sienna sobbing hysterically in her designer dress, Preston looking physically ill in the corner, and my father completely frozen, staring at me as I held a rusted bank ledger and a stack of federal documents. The entire extended family stopped dead in their tracks. The cheerful morning greetings died in their throats as they took in the absolute destruction of our perfect family image. Aunt Viv, the loudest and most gossipy elder in our entire family, stepped forward, pushing her way to the front of the group. She demanded to know exactly what was going on. She wanted to know why Sienna was crying on the floor and why I was standing there holding legal documents like a prosecutor. My father snapped out of his paralyzed state. His instinct for preserving his social image overriding his sheer panic, he immediately stepped in front of Aunt Viv, puffing out his chest and attempting to violently spin the narrative. He pointed a shaking finger at me and loudly declared to the entire extended family that Maya had gone completely crazy. He yelled that I was trying to steal my sister's vacation fund out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. He claimed that I was bitter and resentful and was trying to ruin the family celebration with fake legal threats. I did not yell back at him. I did not even bother to defend myself against his pathetic lies. I simply looked past him and locked eyes with my attorney. Isaiah walked calmly across the room, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. He approached the massive 85-inch smart television mounted on the living room wall. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a sleek, high-definition media cable, and plugged my digital tablet directly into the screen. I turned to look at my father and the sea of confused relatives filling the room. I told them, "Let us show the family what jealousy looks like," my voice cutting through the tension like glass. The giant screen flickered to life, casting a bright, harsh glow over the bewildered faces of my extended family. I projected the full, undeniable timeline of the massive financial fraud for everyone to see in stunning high resolution. My father panicked. He lunged toward the media console, desperately trying to unplug the television and hide the evidence. But Isaiah was faster. My attorney stepped smoothly into his path, firmly blocking my father from reaching the screen. My father was forced to back away, trapped by the cold, silent warning in Isaiah's eyes. The family watched in stunned, absolute silence as I swiped through the documents, displaying them on the massive screen. I showed them the forged quitclaim deed with my stolen signature clearly visible for everyone to read. I pulled up the digital web of money laundering shell companies that Preston had created. I displayed the back-end analytics of Sienna fake influencer accounts proving to our aunts and uncles that her entire luxury lifestyle was a complete fabrication built on zero real engagement and zero actual sponsors. The room was so quiet, you could hear the soft hum of the television as I systematically dismantled the illusions they had all worshipped for years. I did not stop there. I specifically highlighted the massive $900,000 wire transfer, expanding the document, so the numbers filled the entire screen. I stood in front of my family and broke down the technical details of the fraud so thoroughly and clinically that there was absolutely no room for denial. I explained exactly how the stolen funds from my townhouse were routed through Preston shell companies and laundered directly into his failing wealth management firm. I detailed how my father had willingly provided my stolen social security number to push the fraudulent deal through the federal system. I stripped away every last shred of Preston arrogant finance. Bro facade, exposing him as a desperate thief who was using his own wife as a criminal pawn. He shrank back against the wall, sweating through his custom suit, looking exactly like a cornered rat who knew there was no escape. I walked them through the specific dates and timestamps showing how every single luxury vacation and designer handbag was paid for with stolen money. The extended family stared at the massive screen, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the betrayal they had all looked up to. My parents and Preston. They had all envied Sienna, perfect life. Now they were watching the undeniable proof that the family empire was nothing but a criminal enterprise built on my stolen identity. I left the final digital routing map displayed on the screen, the bright red lines connecting the fake accounts directly to Preston corporate server, showing the exact flow of the stolen money and exposing his massive web of lies. Just as the reality of the presentation settled over the silent room, Aunt Viv stepped forward. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. She let out a sharp, audible gasp that echoed in the quiet space. She raised a trembling finger, pointing directly at one specific routing number, highlighted in bright red on the massive screen. Her loud, confident voice was suddenly shaking with absolute terror. She looked away from the television and stared directly at my brother-in-law. "Wait a minute," she said, her words trembling in the heavy air. "Preston, is that routing number from the Oak Creek Trust?" The name of the Oak Creek Trust hung in the heavy air like a physical blow. The entire room turned to look at the bright red numbers glowing on the massive television screen. The sudden realization of what those numbers meant seemed to suck all the oxygen right out of the grand foyer. It was as if a massive shockwave had rippled through the polished floors, paralyzing everyone in their Sunday best. Uncle Greg was the oldest and most highly respected man in our entire extended family. He was a man who had worked with his calloused hands his whole life, putting in 50 and 60-hour weeks at the regional manufacturing plant before finally retiring. He was a no-nonsense patriarch who valued hard work, integrity, and absolute honesty above everything else. He had trusted his brilliant son-in-law to manage the nest egg he had bled for decades to build. He slowly stepped forward, pushing past my father and Aunt Viv. His eyes were completely locked on the screen. He did not say a single word, but the sheer physical gravity of his presence made the room feel incredibly dangerous. Preston started to physically shake, He backed away until his shoulders hit the wall, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal, realizing the exits were permanently closed. He held up his manicured hands in a desperate defensive gesture and started stammering out a rapid-fire stream of corporate jargon, trying to confuse the older man. He smiled a sick, terrified smile and tried to spin the reality of the screen. "It is just a standard liquidity transfer, Greg," he said, his voice cracking with pure panic. Market fluctuations required a temporary asset reallocation to protect the principal investment. It is a completely normal escrow bridging strategy designed to maximize your quarterly yield. He was talking so fast, the words were bleeding together desperately, throwing out terms like arbitrage and fiduciary duty, hoping to blind my uncle with complicated financial terminology. I did not let him finish his pathetic performance. I stepped directly between Preston and my uncle, cutting through the dense corporate jargon like a knife. I looked Uncle Greg dead in the eye and spoke with brutal honesty. "He drained your retirement fund." "Uncle Greg," I said, my voice steady and clear, "the money Preston used to try and buy my house was not his own. It was stolen directly from your 401k, the life savings you trusted him to manage." Uncle Greg stared at me, and I pointed back to the screen. I broke down the exact technical details of the massive fraud so thoroughly and clinically that Preston's entire finance bro facade was completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a desperate thief. I traced the routing numbers for the whole family, showing exactly how Preston had systematically liquidated every single asset in the Oak Creek Trust. Over the past 6 months, I showed them the exact date he emptied the mutual funds and the exact minute he sold off the municipal bonds. I explained how he had transferred the hard cash from Uncle Greg's secure retirement accounts into a fake shell holding company, and then wired it directly to himself to cover his own massive corporate debts. I turned to Sienna, who was still weeping on the floor, and pointed at the luxury items surrounding us. I showed the family how the money that Uncle Greg had sacrificed decades to save had been entirely blown on Sienna's fake luxury influencer lifestyle. It paid for her custom designer dresses, her lavish tropical vacations, and her thousands of fake internet followers. It paid for the sports cars sitting in the driveway and the down payment on the very fraud he was trying to commit against me today. Preston's great financial genius was nothing more than robbing his own relatives to fund a pathetic illusion of endless wealth. I watched the realization hit my uncle. His face went completely pale as he looked at his own financial ruin displayed in 4K resolution. Before his eyes, 40 years of grueling physical labor. 40 years of missed family holidays and aching bones and careful saving. All of it wiped out by a greedy, arrogant coward wearing a custom-tailored suit. Preston was not a visionary wealth manager. He was just a common parasite who preyed on his own family members because he knew they would trust him without question. I looked at my mother and father, who were now completely silent, their own grand illusions shattered by the undeniable reality that they had fiercely defended the destruction of their own brother-in-law. The heavy silence finally broke, and the entire extended family erupted into absolute chaos. Aunts and uncles who also had their money tied up with Preston began shouting over each other. Pure panic and rage filling the grand living room. Cousins were yelling demands for their own account statements. Aunt Viv started screaming that she had just given Preston her entire life savings last month. My father was desperately trying to backtrack and calm everyone down, but nobody was listening to him anymore. The pristine, wealthy image of our family was burning to the ground right in front of them, turning the elegant champagne brunch into a scene of absolute devastation and despair. But Uncle Greg did not yell. He did not join the chaotic screaming match or demand a verbal explanation. He simply moved with a terrifying, silent speed that nobody expected from a man his age. He closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides, completely ignoring my father's weak attempts to intervene. He reached out with his thick, calloused hands and grabbed Preston directly by the collar of his expensive tailored suit, the fine fabric tearing slightly under his immense grip. Uncle Greg lifted him completely off his feet, and violently pinned the cornered rat against the cold marble pillar in the center of the foyer. Uncle Greg held Preston pinned against the cold marble pillar with a grip like industrial steel. Preston was desperately gasping for air, his expensive tailored suit bunching up around his neck and his custom silk tie twisting like a hangman's noose. The polished imported loafers he was so incredibly proud of were slipping and sliding wildly against the smooth floor as he frantically tried to find his footing. He was no longer the arrogant wealth manager who looked down on everyone from his corner glass office. He was just a terrified, soft coward, realizing that all his federal laws and corporate jargon meant absolutely nothing to a man who had worked with his bare hands for over 40 years. The rest of the extended family was screaming in the background, demanding immediate answers about their stolen life savings. But the sound was just a chaotic roar echoing off the high ceilings of the grand foyer. Suddenly, Sienna let out an ear-piercing shriek that cut right through the deafening noise of the angry crowd. She scrambled up from the floor, her ruined designer dress catching under her knees as she sprinted across the room. Her mind was completely shattered by the reality of the situation. But instead of accepting the undeniable fact that her husband was a criminal, she desperately clung to the fragile delusion of her perfect luxury life. She threw herself at Uncle Greg, grabbing his thick, calloused forearms and trying to pry his massive hands off her husband. She was crying hysterically, screaming at the top of her lungs, and blaming me for everything. She looked over her shoulder and screamed at me, demanding to know what I had done to her husband. She yelled that I was a jealous, miserable monster trying to destroy her beautiful high society marriage. Just because I was bitter and alone. She was literally fighting her own family to protect the very man who had used her as a pawn in a federal crime. Preston was hyperventilating, his face turning a blotchy shade of purple as Uncle Greg absolutely refused to let him go. He was terrified, completely blinded by his own panic and the sudden physical reality of being held accountable for his actions. When Sienna grabbed him, trying to pull him free, he did not look at her with love or gratitude or relief. He did not see his devoted wife trying to save him from danger. He only saw another obstacle, another annoying heavy weight dragging him down and restricting his movement in his blind panic. His true nature completely took over. He let out a guttural sound of pure disgust and violently shoved Sienna away from him. He pushed her so hard with both hands that her feet completely left the ground. She flew backward, her arms flailing wildly in the empty air before she crashed down hard onto the unforgiving marble floor. The sickening sound of her impact echoed through the grand space, stopping a few of the screaming relatives in their tracks. Sienna lay on the floor completely stunned, gasping for the breath that had been knocked out of her lungs. But Preston did not even look down to see if she was hurt. The aristocratic Ivy League mask that he had worn for years finally shattered into a million tiny pieces, revealing the rotten, bigoted core. Hiding underneath the smooth-talking corporate prince vanished, and all that was left was a cornered, arrogant elitist who felt absolute contempt for the people he had stolen from. He looked around the room at my parents, my aunts and uncles, and his eyes burned with deep-seated racism and unadulterated classist hatred. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing off the expensive chandelier above us, telling us to get our filthy hands off him. He yelled that we were all crazy and that he was sick to death of pretending to respect a bunch of uncultured ghetto nobodies. His face was twisted into an ugly snarl as he pointed a shaking finger at my father, who was standing frozen in absolute shock. Preston screamed that he never actually loved Sienna and that he only married her because Andre had aggressively sold him a massive lie. He told the entire room that my father had practically begged him to marry into the family, promising him that they were loaded with generational wealth and owned prime real estate. Preston spat on the marble floor and yelled that he only put a ring on Sienna's finger because he thought he was getting unrestricted access to an elite financial dynasty. He screamed that he had to drain Uncle Greg's pathetic retirement accounts and steal my townhouse just to keep his firm afloat. because he quickly realized the entire family was nothing but a bunch of broke, fake rich frauds pretending to be high society. He did not stop there, the adrenaline and fear pushing him over the edge of sanity. He laughed a manic, unhinged laugh and mocked my father's desperate attempts to sound sophisticated. At country club dinners, he mocked Sienna's desperate need for validation, calling her a pathetic empty shell who cared more about shopping bags than real life. He yelled that he was inherently better than all of us because of his pure bloodline and his prestigious degree, and that he deserved every single penny he took because we were simply too stupid and too inferior to understand how real wealth actually worked. He called my family disgusting racial slurs that hung in the air like thick, toxic smoke. The words leaving his mouth were so vile, so deeply racist, and so filled with venom that the entire room instantly stopped shouting. The chaotic screaming of 20 angry relatives died in a fraction of a second, leaving a dead, heavy silence in the grand foyer. The only sound left was the ragged breathing of a man who had just shown his true colors to a room full of people he had systematically robbed. Sienna was still sitting on the cold marble floor, her tear-streaked face frozen in a mask of absolute horror. She slowly looked up at the man she had worshipped, the man she thought was her high society prince, and finally saw the hideous monster hiding underneath the tailored clothes. She saw that her entire marriage, her luxury lifestyle, and her identity were completely worthless, built on a foundation of racism and greed. Preston stood there panting, his chest heaving as he suddenly realized the fatal mistake he had just made. He looked around the deadly silent room, taking in the dark, furious glares of my uncles and cousins. Uncle Greg's massive hands slowly tightened their grip on Preston's collar, his knuckles turning solid. White Preston had thought he was so much smarter and better than everyone else. But as the devastating silence stretched on, he finally understood that he had just sealed his own grave. The sickening sound of Preston choking against the cold marble pillar was the only noise in the room. Until Sienna finally broke the silence, she scrambled backward across the shattered glass, dragging her ruined designer dress across the floor. Her hands were cut and bleeding, but she did not even seem to notice. She crawled directly toward our parents, her breath coming in ragged, hysterical gasps. She reached out with trembling hands, grabbing at our mother's skirt, begging for someone to comfort her, begging for someone to tell her that this was all a terrible nightmare. She looked up at the two people who had created this monster of a family, desperately waiting for them to shield her from the absolute destruction of her perfect life. But my parents did not look down at her. They did not drop to the floor to wrap their arms around their favorite child. They were both completely paralyzed, standing frozen in the middle of the grand foyer, too busy hyperventilating to even acknowledge the sobbing mess at their feet. My mother Renee was staring at the massive television screen, where the bright red routing numbers from Uncle Greg's drained retirement account were still glaring like a warning beacon. The blood had completely vanished from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking hollow and aged. The illusion of our elite family dynasty was burning to ash all around her. But it was not just the shame that had her gasping for air. It was the sudden terrifying realization of what Preston's confession actually meant. My mother slowly turned her head to look at my father. Her eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen in her before. She grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging deep into the fabric of his suit jacket. She shook him violently, trying to snap him out of his catatonic state. "Andre," she said, her voice trembling so badly it was barely a whisper. "Tell them you did not know about Greg's money. Tell them right now." My father just stood there swaying slightly on his feet, his eyes darting frantically between his furious brother-in-law holding Preston against the pillar and the digital evidence glowing on the wall. "Tell them, Andre!" my mother shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "Tell them you had nothing to do with Preston's firm. Tell them you did not know he was stealing from your own family." My father looked at his wife, and then he looked at the ring of furious relatives surrounding him, the men and women he had looked down upon for decades, The family members he had constantly judged for not wearing the right brands or driving the right cars. He looked at me standing calmly beside my attorney, and the last remaining pillar of his immense ego finally snapped. My father slowly dropped to his knees right next to Sienna. He did not kneel to comfort his crying daughter. He knelt because his legs simply could no longer support the crushing weight of his own monumental arrogance. He stared at the marble floor and began to confess. His voice was completely devoid of its usual booming authority, leaving only the pathetic whimper of a broken man. He admitted everything to the silent room. He confessed that Preston's wealth management firm had been drowning in massive debt almost from the very beginning. He told my mother that the elite white son-in-law she was so incredibly proud to parade around their exclusive country club was actually a financial failure, who had been bleeding cash for years. But my father could not bear the social embarrassment of Sienna's marriage failing. He could not stand the thought of his wealthy friends finding out that the brilliant financial prodigy he had brought into the family was a total fraud. So to maintain the absolute illusion of their high society status, my father had secretly co-signed every single one of Preston's initial corporate business loans. The extended family let out a collective gasp of horror as the reality of my father's confession settled over them. He had literally mortgaged his own soul just to keep up appearances. He kept his head bowed, staring blankly at the floor as he explained the devastating legal reality of what he had done. He admitted that by putting his name on those corporate documents, he had legally bound himself to Preston's failing firm. He told my mother that he had given Preston full access to manage the family trusts because he desperately needed Preston to generate enough capital to pay off the massive loans they were hiding. My father was sobbing now, tears dripping off his chin and splashing onto the polished marble. He confessed that because of the ironclad co-sign agreements, he was personally and legally liable for every single penny that Preston had stolen from Uncle Greg to cover the firm's staggering losses. My father wept as he explained that Preston's entire business structure was a house of cards, and that his own signature was on the foundation. He had allowed a racist, arrogant thief to drain the life savings of his own brother-in-law, just so he could keep playing golf with the elite members of a society that never even respected him. He had thrown my identity away and tried to sell my home out from under me because he was desperately trying to plug the massive holes in a sinking ship that he was legally chained to. My mother let out a guttural scream of pure despair, tearing her hands through her own hair as she collapsed onto the floor next to her husband and her favorite daughter. The three of them were a tangled, miserable pile of ruined silk and shattered egos crying over the absolute destruction of their fake empire. They had sacrificed me, they had lied and stolen and conspired to destroy my future, all to protect a hollow, rotting illusion. And now that illusion had finally collapsed and crushed them underneath its weight. Isaiah stepped forward, his presence instantly commanding the attention of the entire room. He looked down at my parents writhing on the floor and then glanced up at the television screen where the federal documents were still proudly displayed. He did not show a single ounce of pity. He adjusted his expensive cuffs and cleared his throat, the sound snapping through the crying and the chaos like a whip crack. With the federal penalties for wire fraud, the stolen retirement funds, and the mortgage defaults, Isaiah said, his voice smooth and lethally calm, "Your total liability is $4.2 million. He paused, letting the massive number echo in the dead silence of the grand foyer. He looked directly at my father, who was staring up at him with wide, terrified eyes. As of this exact minute, Isaiah stated coldly, "You are bankrupt." The word bankrupt hung in the grand foyer like an executioner's blade, slicing through the heavy silence of the room. It was the one word my parents feared more than death itself. Poverty was their ultimate nightmare, the absolute destruction of their entire carefully curated existence. My mother let out a strangled, gasping sound, her perfectly manicured hands clawing at the collar of her expensive silk blouse, as if she was suddenly suffocating under the weight of her own lies. My father remained on the floor, his shoulders trembling violently. the reality of his massive $4.2 million liability crushing the last remaining fragments of his inflated ego. He slowly lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were completely bloodshot, filled with a raw, desperate terror that I had never witnessed in my entire life. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist. The man who had always looked at me with thinly veiled disgust and disappointment was completely gone. In his place was a pathetic, shattered old man, staring into the absolute abyss of his own ruin. He looked at Uncle Greg, who was still gripping Preston against the marble pillar, and then he looked back at me, and then my father did something that shocked the entire room into a stunned, breathless silence. He crawled. He literally dragged himself forward on his hands and knees, his expensive imported trousers dragging through the spilled champagne and the scattered shards of broken glass. He crawled across the cold marble floor, moving desperately toward where I stood next to Isaiah. My aunts and uncles watched in sheer disbelief as the head of our family abandoned every last shred of his dignity. He reached my feet, his shaking hands hovering just inches from my shoes, as if he wanted to grab my ankles but was too terrified to touch me. Maya, he choked out his voice. A wet, pathetic sob. Maya, please, my brilliant daughter, my beautiful, successful girl. The sudden shift in his tone was sickeningly sweet, a desperate manipulation born out of sheer terror. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. You own that massive agency. You have millions of dollars sitting in your accounts. You are the only one who can fix this mess. You can bail us out. Maya, you can pay Greg back and make this all go away. Please, you have to save us. We are your blood. You are my daughter. You cannot just stand there and let your own family lose everything. I looked down at the pathetic man groveling at my feet. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, no sudden urge to rescue the parents who had willingly sacrificed me to protect their fake golden child. I looked at his tear-stained face and remembered how just an hour ago he had stood in this very room and proudly called me a worthless, jealous recluse. I remembered how eagerly he had handed over my social security number to a criminal, how quickly he had thrown me to the wolves to preserve his elite country club image. Blood did not mean loyalty to them. Blood was just another resource for them to exploit when they ran out of other options. I did not step back, and I did not break eye contact. I let him sit there on his knees in front of the entire extended family, feeling the full crushing weight of his absolute humiliation. The silence in the room was so thick, you could hear the soft ticking of the grand-grandfather clock in the hallway. My mother was still weeping on the floor next to Sienna, completely incapable of offering her husband any support. They were entirely stripped of their power, their social status, and their fake wealth, leaving them with absolutely nothing but their own pathetic desperation. I slowly turned to Isaiah without breaking my gaze from my father. My attorney smoothly unlatched his sleek leather briefcase, the crisp sound echoing clearly in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a final thick stack of legal documents bound together with a heavy metal clip. He handed the massive contract to me, and I held it up so my father could see the dense pages of legal text. I will restore Uncle Greg's retirement fund, I said, my voice echoing cold and hollow across the marble foyer. I will personally write the check to cover every single penny that your golden son-in-law stole from him, so that a good, honest man does not have to suffer for your disgusting greed. I will save Uncle Greg, and I will pay off the immediate federal penalties to keep you out of a federal prison cell. My father let out a loud, dramatic sob of relief, his shoulders slumping as he began to thank me profusely. But I immediately held up my hand, cutting off his pathetic words of gratitude. I am not finished, I stated, my eyes locking onto his. You are not getting a bailout. You are getting a buyout. There is a price for my money, and it is completely non-negotiable. I dropped the thick, heavy contract directly onto the floor in front of his knees. I will pay the $4.2 million, I told him, but in exchange, You and Mother are going to sign this document right here and right now. It legally signs over 100% of your remaining physical assets to my firm. It includes the deed to this house, the equity you have left, your investment portfolios, your luxury cars, and every single piece of designer jewelry. Mother is currently hiding in her safe. You will liquidate your entire fake life to pay me back for saving you from a federal indictment. My father stared at the thick contract on the floor, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock as the reality of my terms washed over him. My mother let out another piercing scream from across the room, completely horrified at the thought of losing her precious status symbols. But I did not flinch. I stared down at the two people who had created this nightmare and delivered my final absolute condition. You sign everything over to me, right now. I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper, and you leave this house today with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your backs. The silence that followed my demand was so absolute, it felt like the air itself had frozen solid. My father remained on his knees staring at the contract on the marble floor, as if it were a venomous snake. But it was my mother who finally broke the spell. Renee snapped the sheer, arrogant vanity that had fueled her entire existence. Simply could not process the concept of walking away with nothing. The very idea of losing her designer wardrobe, her diamond tennis bracelets, and her perfectly manicured social standing was a fate she considered far worse than death. She slowly stood up, her shaking legs finding their footing as the initial shock morphed into a desperate, vicious rage. She looked down at her husband, still kneeling pathetic and broken, and let out a sound of pure disgust. She kicked the thick contract away from her expensive heels and glared at me with a hatred so deep it made her look completely unrecognizable. "I am not signing a single page of that garbage," she hissed, her voice rising into a shrill, desperate shriek. "You are out of your mind, Maya. You think you can just march into my beautiful home and strip me of everything I have built. You think you can take my jewelry and my cars and throw me out onto the street like some common trash. I am your mother and I will not let you ruin me." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone, her manicured fingers trembling violently as she gripped the device. She held it up like it was a loaded weapon, pointing it directly at my face. Her eyes were wide and unhinged, the last desperate act of a woman watching her entire fake empire crumble to dust. "You listen to me right now, you ungrateful little brat," she screamed, the veins in her neck popping against her skin. "You are going to pay Greg's money back, and you are going to leave my assets completely alone, or I swear to God I will destroy you. I will go straight to the media." Renee threatened, her voice echoing off the high ceiling of the grand foyer. "I will call every single gossip blog and news outlet in Atlanta, and I will tell them exactly what kind of monster you really are. I will tell them that you are an abusive, ungrateful daughter who deliberately drove her own family out onto the streets just out of pure spite. I will ruin your precious agency. I will make sure every client you have drops your firm by tomorrow morning. I will paint you as a heartless sociopath, and I will completely destroy your precious reputation." My extended family watched in stunned disbelief as she screamed her threats. The aunts and uncles who had just watched Preston admit to stealing their life savings were now watching my mother attempt to blackmail me into protecting her diamond rings, instead of showing a single ounce of remorse or concern for her own brother-in-law. She was entirely focused on preserving her country club membership. She screamed that she was the matriarch of this family, and that nobody was going to treat her like a peasant. She looked around the room, demanding that someone defend her. But everyone just stared at her with complete disgust. Uncle Greg was still holding Preston against the pillar, but his eyes were locked on his sister, watching her true colors bleed out onto the floor. I did not blink. I did not flinch or step back from her frantic screaming. I just stood there and let her exhaust herself, watching the pathetic display of a woman who had absolutely nothing left but empty threats. When she finally paused to take a ragged breath, I simply nodded to my attorney. Isaiah did not say a word. He stepped forward calmly, closing the distance between them, his expensive shoes making zero sound on the marble floor. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out 2 crisp sheets of paper. He held them out to my mother. She stared at them suspiciously for a second before snatching them out of his hand. She looked down at the first page, and the vicious sneer instantly melted off her face. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a ghost. The first document Isaiah handed her was a pre-drafted, strictly enforced cease and desist order prepared by one of the most ruthless litigation firms in the state. But it was the second piece of paper that made her breath hitch in her throat. It was a printed copy of a press release fully drafted and ready to be issued by the district attorney's office. I watched her eyes scan the text, her hands shaking so badly the paper made a loud rustling noise in the quiet room. The document detailed a comprehensive investigation into a 14-year-old case of severe identity theft and massive credit card fraud. It outlined exactly how a woman named Renee had systematically stolen the social security numbers of her own elderly relatives, including her own mother, to open dozens of secret lines of credit, racking up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to fund her luxury lifestyle before quietly burying the evidence and letting her family members take the financial fall. She thought that secret was dead and buried. She thought she had successfully hidden her own criminal past behind her expensive clothes and her fake high society smile. But I had spent the last month digging through every single skeleton in this family's closet. I had found the old banking records, the forged signatures, and the silent settlements she had forced on her victims decades ago. The press release had all the dates, all the exact dollar amounts, and all the undeniable proof needed to reopen the statute of limitations. My mother slowly looked up from the paper, her mouth opening and closing silently. She looked at me, and the absolute terror in her eyes was finally real. The empty threats were completely gone, replaced by the crushing realization that she was entirely trapped. I looked down at the pen lying next to the contract on the cold floor, and then back up to her terrified eyes. The power dynamic had completely shifted. The woman who had spent my entire life calling me a worthless disappointment was now standing in front of me, shaking like a leaf, realizing that I held her entire freedom in the palm of my hand. I did not feel any sympathy. I did not feel any daughterly affection. I only felt the cold, hard justice of a reckoning that was decades in the making. "Sign the contract, Mom," I said, my voice echoing in the dead silent room loud and clear for the entire extended family to hear. "You either pick up that pen right now and sign over every single asset you possess, or I hit send on that email and you trade your designer dresses for an orange jumpsuit." I looked at the heavy grandfather clock standing in the corner of the foyer, the pendulum swinging back and forth with a steady, heavy rhythm. "You have exactly 60 seconds. The heavy brass pendulum of the grand-grandfather clock swung back and forth, each metallic tick echoing like a gavel, slamming down on a wooden block. 59, 58, 57. The countdown hung in the air, suffocating everyone in the grand foyer. The extended family stood completely frozen, a ring of wide, terrified eyes watching the ultimate power shift unfold right in front of them. The mighty, untouchable dynasty was being dismantled, second by agonizing second. My aunts and uncles, who had spent decades shrinking under my parents' judgmental glares, were now witnessing the absolute destruction of the empire. They watched in a bizarre mix of horror and profound awe as the truth finally dragged my parents down into the dirt. Down on the floor, Sienna suddenly seemed to snap out of her hysterical crying fit. The reality of my words finally penetrated her thick bubble of entitlement. She looked at the massive contract lying on the cold marble, and then she looked at her mother, realizing exactly what was about to happen. "Mom, no!" she shrieked, her voice breaking into a hideous whining pitch that grated against the heavy silence. "You cannot sign that. You cannot give her everything. What about my allowance? What about my car? What about the country club fees? You cannot just leave me with nothing. You have to do something, Mom. You have to fix this. You cannot let her take my life away. Sienna was completely oblivious to the fact that her mother was literally staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence. She did not care about the identity theft or the credit card fraud, or the fact that Renee was hyperventilating from pure terror. All Sienna cared about was her designer wardrobe and her weekly spa treatments. She grabbed her mother's arm, shaking her frantically, refusing to accept that her endless supply of free money had just been permanently cut off. She begged and whined, acting like a spoiled toddler, throwing a tantrum over a toy while her entire family collapsed into ruins. It was a sickening display of pure narcissism, proving exactly how deeply my parents had poisoned their golden child. But Renee did not even look at her favorite daughter. The illusion of the perfect family had been totally shattered, and there was no energy left to maintain the fake motherly devotion. My mother slowly pulled her arm away from Sienna's grasp. Her eyes were completely hollow, entirely dead and defeated. The threat of the orange jumpsuit, the absolute certainty that I had all the evidence required to lock her away for the rest of her life, finally broke the very last thread of her monstrous vanity. She let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a dying animal surrendering to the inevitable. 40 seconds. I reminded her, my voice devoid of any emotion. 39:38. Isaiah took a single step forward and silently held out his silver Mont Blanc pen. Its polished surface gleamed under the crystal chandelier, a beautiful, expensive tool of their ultimate destruction. My father was the first to move. He was still on his knees. His suit ruined his dignity. Entirely gone. He reached up with a trembling hand and took the pen from my attorney. He dragged the thick contract toward him, his tears splashing onto the pristine white paper. He did not read a single word. He just flipped to the back page and aggressively scribbled his signature, his hand shaking so violently the letters looked like a jagged, broken line. The man who had always cared more about his financial portfolio than his own daughter had just signed away every single penny to my name. My father dropped the pen on the document and curled into a tight ball on the floor, weeping openly in front of the relatives he used to mock. Isaiah calmly picked up the pen and held it out to my mother. She stared at it like it was coated in poison. 20 seconds, I said, the countdown sealing her fate with a guttural sob of pure defeat. Renee snatched the pen from his fingers. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, joining her broken husband on the floor. She leaned over the contract, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy clumps across her face, and she signed her name. The signature was weak and shaky, a pathetic surrender from a woman who had once thought she was a queen. It was done. The transfer was complete. They were officially stripped of their ill-gotten wealth, their fake prestige, and their stolen status. Isaiah swiftly retrieved the signed documents, sliding them safely back into his sleek leather briefcase, the sharp click of the locks echoing finality. The money was officially gone. The safety net had been completely removed, and Uncle Greg's stolen retirement was effectively secured. Standing by the marble pillar, Preston watched the entire transaction, his greedy eyes tracking the contract as it disappeared into the briefcase. The realization hit him instantly. There was no more money. My parents were bankrupt. I was not going to bail him out, and his entire fraudulent firm was about to implode, taking him down with it. The arrogant golden son-in-law realized the ship had fully sunk, and he decided to bail. He slowly released his grip on the marble pillar and began taking silent, calculated steps backward, trying to slip away from the crying pile of my family on the floor. He moved desperately toward the swinging kitchen doors, hoping to sneak out through the garage before anyone noticed he kept his head down, sliding his feet across the floor like a coward, desperate to escape the consequences of his massive financial crimes, leaving his hysterical wife and ruined in-laws behind, without a second thought. But Preston did not even make it halfway across the room. Suddenly, the heavy darkness outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows was pierced by intense, blinding bursts of light. Bright, violent flashes of red and blue painted the walls of the grand foyer, spinning and strobing across the marble floor in a frantic, urgent rhythm. The entire room froze. The crying stopped. The whispering ceased. Even Sienna's whining was instantly silenced as the flashing police lights illuminated their terrified faces in chaotic alternating colors. The heavy thud of fists hitting the door sent a massive shockwave of pure panic through the grand foyer. My aunts and uncles stumbled backward away from the entrance, suddenly terrified of being caught in the crossfire of a federal raid. Preston completely froze in his tracks, his cowardly escape route cut off as he stared wide-eyed at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the crystal chandelier. My parents remained on the floor, paralyzed by the deafening sound of authority, finally crashing down upon their fake empire. The absolute silence of the room was entirely shattered by the heavy, chaotic reality that there was nowhere left to hide before anyone could even take a breath. A series of deafening, thunderous knocks pounded against the heavy oak of the front door. The blows were so forceful the entire door frame rattled. "FBI, open up." Before anyone could even process the deafening command, the heavy mahogany double doors were violently shoved open, crashing against the interior walls with a force that shook the entire house. A swarm of federal agents and local police officers flooded into the grand foyer, their dark tactical gear striking a brutal contrast against the pristine white marble and the glittering crystal chandelier hanging above us. They moved with terrifying speed and precision, fanning out across the room and completely surrounding my frozen family members. The flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers outside were now spilling directly into the house, casting harsh, erratic shadows across the faces of my ruined parents and my trembling sister. Uncle Greg slowly lowered his arms, finally releasing his tight grip on Preston. He stepped back and pulled his cell phone out of his pocket, looking over at me with a grim nod of absolute solidarity, while everyone else had been distracted by my mother's pathetic screaming and my father's desperate groveling. Uncle Greg had been silently texting the authorities, coordinating with the local precinct to corroborate the massive SEC tip I had submitted weeks ago. He had kept Preston pinned to that pillar just long enough for the trap to spring completely shut. An agent with a stern, weathered face stepped directly into the center of the room, holding up a heavy stack of warrants. He did not care about the shattered champagne glasses or the ruined designer clothes scattered across the floor. He looked straight at Preston, whose face had gone completely gray, and announced that he was under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. The moment the metal handcuffs came out of the agent's tactical belt, the slick, arrogant financial prodigy completely lost his mind. Preston let out a high-pitched, panicked shriek that sounded exactly like a terrified animal. He scrambled backward, pressing his spine against the cold marble pillar, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for any possible escape route. But he was entirely boxed in by federal agents. When the officers moved in to grab his arms, Preston absolutely snapped. He threw his hands out and pointed a shaking finger directly at my father, who was still cowering on the floor next to my mother. "It was his idea," Preston screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysterical desperation. "He gave me the money. He signed the corporate loans. He handed over the social security numbers. Arrest him. He is the one who funded the whole thing. I was just following his directions. You need to arrest him right now." My father shot up from the floor, his own terror instantly morphing into a vicious, feral rage. The two men who had spent years bonding over their shared arrogance, drinking expensive scotch and mocking anyone they viewed as inferior, were now viciously tearing each other apart to save their own skin. "He is a lying con artist," my father roared back, spitting as he yelled at the agents. "He manipulated all of us. He stole from my family and forged my signature. He is a parasite. Arrest him and get him out of my house." My father took a step toward Preston, his fists clenched at his sides, looking like he wanted to physically strangle the man. He used to parade around the country club as his brilliant son-in-law. "You arrogant little thief!" my father bellowed, pointing a shaking finger right back at Preston. "I gave you everything. I opened every door for you, and you used my name to build a rotting house of cards. You are the one going to prison, not me. You hear me, Preston. You are nothing but a common criminal. Preston let out a wild, desperate laugh, struggling against the agent's grip. Oh, you are just as guilty as I am. Andre. He spat, his face red with exertion. You knew exactly how much debt the firm had. You knew Uncle Greg's money was mixed in with the operational accounts. You just looked the other way because you wanted the prestige. You wanted the bragging rights. You sold out your own family just to keep your country club memberships. You are going down with me, Andre. I will make sure of it. The rest of the family watched this disgusting display of mutual betrayal in absolute horror. Aunts and uncles who had always admired my father's success were now staring at him with pure revulsion, witnessing the ugly, rotting core of his character exposed for everyone to see. Mother was still on the floor, weeping into her hands, unable to stop the two men she worshipped from destroying each other in front of federal agents. They screamed over each other, throwing every ounce of blame and betrayal across the grand foyer, exposing every dirty secret and corrupt handshake that had built their hollow empire. It was the ultimate payoff. Watching the two most entitled narcissistic men in my life completely discard their precious loyalty. The second the federal cuffs appeared, they were like rats drowning in a sinking ship, stepping on each other's heads, just to gasp for one more breath of air. But the federal agents were not interested in their pathetic arguing. They did not care who had signed what or whose ego was bigger. The lead agent simply grabbed Preston by the collar of his custom-tailored suit and violently yanked him forward, spinning him around and slamming him chest first against the marble pillar. The heavy thud of his body hitting the stone echoed through the room, followed by the sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists. Preston thrashed and whined, crying out for his lawyer, as two officers grabbed him by the arms and began dragging him forcefully toward the open front door. He kicked his expensive leather shoes, slipping on the spilled champagne, completely stripped of the untouchable elite aura he had paraded around for years. He looked pathetic and small, his expensive suit wrinkling as they hauled him across the foyer and dragged him out into the flashing lights of the driveway. As they forced him out into the cold night, Preston did not look back. Even once. He did not turn his head to look at his weeping wife. He did not call out Sienna's name or promise her that everything would be okay. He just kept screaming about his father-in-law, throwing the family under the bus to save himself. Right up until they shoved him into the back of a police cruiser and slammed the door shut. Sienna let out a weak, pathetic whimper, reaching her hand out toward the doorway, as the police cruiser carrying her husband disappeared down the street. But there was no one left to comfort her. The illusion of her perfect marriage was shattered. Preston had not even spared her a single glance of remorse or affection. In his final moments of freedom, he had completely abandoned her, the second his own survival was threatened. She was left completely alone, sitting in a pathetic heap on the cold marble floor. Her perfectly planned luxury life had evaporated in less than an hour. Her husband was gone. Her trust fund was seized. The massive European vacation was canceled, and the golden child status she had weaponized against me for decades had been entirely obliterated. She stared blankly at the open front door, the flashing police lights reflecting in her wide, empty eyes. She looked down at her hands, staring at the massive diamond wedding ring on her finger, the ring that had probably been paid for with stolen money. She was sitting in a puddle of spilled champagne and broken glass, entirely stripped of everything that made her special. There would be no more luxury shopping sprees, no more arrogant boasting at family dinners, no more holding her status over my head. She was a bankrupt wife of a federal criminal, left sitting on the floor of a house that now entirely belonged to me. The golden child had finally fallen, and the heavy reality of her new, impoverished life finally crashed down upon her. The heavy oak doors swung open violently as a swarm of federal agents and local police flooded the grand foyer, the sheer force of their entry echoing through the ruined house. Their heavy boots trampled over the spilled champagne and broken glass as they immediately took control of the room. The red and blue lights from the cruisers outside cast harsh, spinning shadows across the walls, illuminating the absolute terror on my parents' faces. The lead agent barked orders, cutting through the chaos as two officers marched straight toward Preston. They grabbed him roughly by the arms, ignoring his frantic screaming and pathetic whining. Preston kicked his expensive leather shoes, slipping on the wet marble as they dragged him out toward the waiting vehicles. His desperate shouting finally fading into the cold night air, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. My parents remained frozen on the floor, completely paralyzed by the absolute destruction of their fake empire. They watched in stunned disbelief as the agents swept through the room, taking notes and securing the final pieces of evidence. The authorities did not stay long. Once they had their primary target and confirmed the scene, they slowly filed out of the house, the heavy front doors remaining wide open as the flashing lights slowly faded down the long private driveway. The grand foyer was plunged back into a tense, quiet isolation. The only sound left was the ragged, pathetic breathing of my mother, attempting to process the fact that she was now entirely ruined. The massive ring of extended family members stood around the room, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal they had just witnessed. Aunts and uncles who had spent decades shrinking under my parents, judgmental glares and arrogant boasting, now stared down at them with a profound, absolute disgust. The illusion of the elite, untouchable dynasty was dead and buried, leaving nothing but the rotting core of my parents' greed exposed for everyone to see. One by one, my relatives turned their backs on the ruined patriarch and his weeping wife. They began to move slowly toward the open front door. Not a single person offered a hand to help my father up. Not a single aunt knelt down to comfort my mother. They silently stepped around them, treating them like pieces of garbage left on the pristine marble floor as they reached the doorway. Each family member paused and turned toward me. They did not speak a single word, but the slow, respectful nods they gave me spoke volumes. They were acknowledging the absolute shift in power, recognizing that the toxic, abusive reign of Andre and Renee was officially over forever. Uncle Greg was the last to leave. The older man looked completely exhausted, but a profound, heavy sense of relief washed over his weathered face. He walked slowly over to where I stood next to Isaiah, and he wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a deep, genuine hug. "Thank you, Maya," he whispered, his voice thick with raw emotion. "Thank you for saving my life and my future, and for finally exposing them for what they really are." He pulled back, giving my shoulder a firm, reassuring squeeze before turning and walking out into the night, pulling the heavy front door shut behind him. The heavy click of the door latch echoed through the massive foyer, leaving an unbearable ringing silence in its wake. There were no more audiences to perform for, no more wealthy relatives to impress. It was just me, my attorney Isaiah, my shattered father, my sobbing mother, and my completely ruined sister Sienna was still sitting in a puddle of spilled champagne, clutching her knees to her chest, her eyes wide and blank as she stared at the empty space where her husband had just been standing before he was dragged away to federal prison. Her perfect life was gone. Her trust fund was gone. Her entire identity had been wiped out in less than an hour. I slowly raised my arm and looked at the face of my watch, the smooth ticking of the small hands sounding incredibly loud in the dead quiet room. I let my cold gaze drop back down to the pathetic pile of ruined silk and shattered egos trembling on my floor. "You have exactly 1 hour left on the eviction notice," I stated, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any sympathy. "You need to start packing your things right now because you are no longer welcome on my property." The words hit my mother like a physical blow. Renee slowly dragged her head up to look at me. Her face was completely unrecognizable, stained with running mascara and twisted in absolute agony. The arrogant high society matriarch who had spent my entire life making me feel like a worthless burden was completely gone, leaving only a terrified, broken woman staring up at her own daughter. She scrambled onto her knees, her hands gripping the edges of her ruined designer skirt. "Maya, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic wet sob, her whole body shaking violently. You cannot do this to us. You cannot just throw us out into the street tonight. We have absolutely nothing left. You took the cars. You took the accounts. Where will we go? Maya, please just give us a week. Just give us a few days to figure something out to find a place to stay. You are my daughter. Please do not leave your mother out in the cold. My father remained absolutely silent beside her, his spirit completely broken. He did not even have the energy to lift his head to beg. Sienna let out a fresh, high-pitched wail of despair, crying over the terrifying realization that she would be leaving this mansion with nothing but the clothes on her back. My mother reached out a shaking hand toward my shoes, weeping hysterically, begging for a tiny scrap of the compassion she had never once shown me when I was the one crying on the floor. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I stared down at her tear-stained face and remembered a dark night many years ago when I was young and desperate and completely alone. I remembered standing in this exact foyer, begging for help, begging for just a tiny bit of support so I could survive the real world. And I remembered exactly what my mother had done to me. She had looked at me with cold disgust and treated me like an inconvenience. I slowly reached into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket, my fingers brushing against the crisp paper. I pulled out a single crisp $200 bill, the exact amount she had once thrown at my feet, like I was a stray dog looking for scraps. I held the bill between my fingers, letting it catch the warm light of the crystal chandelier. My mother stared at the money, her sobbing freezing in her throat as her eyes locked onto the cash, recognizing the painful, sickening poetry of the moment. I opened my fingers and let the bill drop. It fluttered through the air in total, absolute silence, landing gently on the cold marble floor, right next to my mother's. Shaking knees, I looked down at her terrified face, feeling absolutely nothing but the cold, hard satisfaction of ultimate justice. "Try Uber," I said, my voice cutting through the dead silence like a razor blade. "I hear the Motel 6 by the interstate has vacancies." The reality of those words finally sank into their thick skulls, and the sheer panic that followed was a beautiful thing to witness. My mother let out one final choking sob before scrambling up from the marble floor, her expensive heels slipping as she practically crawled toward the grand staircase. My father followed right behind her, a hollow shell of a man stumbling over his own feet. Sienna was the last to move, whining and crying about her designer shoes as she hauled herself up and chased after her parents. They had exactly 60 minutes to pack up their entire lives and get out of my house. I stood at the bottom of the stairs with Isaiah silently watching the pathetic, frantic chaos unfold above us. The heavy thud of footsteps echoed through the massive mansion, followed by the sounds of closets being ripped open and drawers being slammed shut. They were running through the luxurious rooms they had stolen, desperately trying to grab whatever pathetic scraps they were legally allowed to keep. They could not take the jewelry. They could not take the artwork. They could not take anything of actual value, because every single high-ticket item had already been inventoried and seized to pay back the millions they had stolen from Uncle Greg and the rest of their victims. They were frantically throwing sweatpants and plain shirts into bags, mourning the loss of their massive wardrobes. Less than an hour later, the grand matriarch and patriarch of the untouchable dynasty made their final descent down the sweeping staircase. But they did not look like royalty anymore. There was no matched set of luxury luggage. There were no silk garment bags. My parents and my sister were dragging cheap canvas duffel bags and oversized plastic trash bags stuffed with whatever basic clothing they could scramble together. Renee was sweating profusely. Her perfect blowout ruined her makeup smeared down her cheeks, clutching a black garbage bag full of sweaters, like it was a life preserver. Andre looked like a broken old man, his shoulders completely slumped, his chest heaving as he dragged a heavy duffel bag across the foyer, dragging it right over the spilled champagne and broken glass that still stained the floor. Sienna was weeping, openly dragging a mismatched suitcase behind her, complaining loudly that the wheels were catching on the rugs, but nobody came to help her. There were no servants left, no staff to carry their burdens. They had to drag their own trash out of the front door all by themselves. I did not say a word as they passed me. They did not even dare to look me in the eye. They just kept their heads down, shuffling past me like ghosts, completely defeated and entirely ruined. They pushed their way out the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the crushing, humid heat of the Atlanta night. I slowly walked up the grand staircase, leaving the mess in the foyer behind me. I bypassed the guest rooms and walked straight into the master suite, the massive, luxurious room that my mother had spent a fortune decorating. With stolen money was now entirely mine. The air was quiet and still, the frantic energy of their packing already fading into the walls. I walked across the plush carpet and pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping out onto the expansive private balcony that overlooked the front driveway. Down below, the scene was absolutely cinematic. The sprawling circular driveway that used to be filled with their fleet of luxury vehicles, their expensive Range Rovers and their imported sports cars, was completely empty. Every single car had been confiscated, towed away by the authorities hours ago to liquidate their fraudulent assets. My parents and my sister were left standing on the edge of the curb, dragging their trash bags in the stifling Georgia humidity, waiting in the dark for a basic economy rideshare to take them to a cheap roadside motel. The mosquitoes were swarming, the heat was suffocating, and the glorious dynasty was reduced to 3 sweating criminals standing by the side of the road. I heard the soft pop of a cork behind me. I turned to see Isaiah stepping out onto the balcony, holding a chilled bottle of vintage champagne he had found in my father's private reserve. He held 2 crystal flutes pouring the bubbling golden liquid with steady, practiced precision. He handed a glass to me, his face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. We did not need to say anything. The silence between us was heavy with the absolute satisfaction of a perfectly executed operation. We gently clinked our glasses together, the soft chime of the crystal ringing out into the warm night air, a quiet toast to absolute flawless justice. I took a slow sip of the cold champagne, letting the crisp taste ground me in the reality of what I had just accomplished. I leaned against the balcony railing, looking down at the pathetic figures on the curb. One last time, I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel any daughterly guilt. I realized then that I had never actually been seeking revenge. I had not fabricated a single lie, or set any traps to destroy them all. I had done was hold up a mirror of absolute truth to their faces, and they had completely shattered their own reflection by trying to fight it. For my entire life, society and family had pushed the toxic narrative of unconditional forgiveness. They had demanded that I swallow my pride, accept the abuse, and constantly reconcile with people who only saw me as an endless resource to be exploited. But I refused to drink that poison anymore. There would be no forced reconciliation. There would be no tearful hugs or second chances. The blood in our veins did not give them a free pass to destroy my soul. They had built their entire wealthy existence on a foundation of lies and theft, and now they were going to spend the rest of their miserable lives paying for it. I watched the cheap compact rideshare pull up to the curb, its headlights illuminating their exhausted, terrified faces. I watched my father struggle to shove their garbage bags into the tiny trunk, while my mother and sister squeezed into the cramped back seat without waiting to see them drive away. I turned my back on the driveway. I walked off the balcony and stepped back into the quiet sanctuary of my master suite. The air inside was cool and peaceful, completely cleansed of their toxic presence. I reached out and firmly grabbed the brass handles of the heavy oak balcony doors, pulling them shut. The thick wood sealed away the humid night air and the sounds of the outside world, leaving me in total, absolute silence. The heavy metal lock clicked into place with a sharp, satisfying sound. I took another sip of my champagne, breathing in the deep, pure air of my own home. I was finally free. I was completely untouchable. And I was absolutely victorious. True security comes from within, not from toxic family members who try to dim your light when you stop seeking validation from people who only want to exploit you. You open the door to your own freedom and success. Blood does not excuse abuse. Walking away from a toxic environment is often the bravest, most empowering choice you can ever make. You are the sole author of your worth, and your peace is absolutely non-negotiable. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect yourself? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more.